I was hiking alone that summer, covering the moorland and pasture routes in the northern countryside where the hills roll endlessly and the air smells of wet soil and sheep dung. It was warm, the kind of heavy, still warmth that makes everything feel close. The flies were bad that year. You could hear them before you saw them. Little clouds of them hovering over puddles or buzzing low through the grass where the ground stayed damp. I remember brushing them away from my face every few seconds as I walked. The fields stretched for miles, broken by old stone walls and wire fences. The same patterns of pale rocks, rough grass, and scattered white sheep in every direction. It was mid-afternoon, the light hard and flat, when I noticed something strange off to my right. A shape lying down near a break in one of the fences, too still to be resting. From a distance, it looked like a sheep that had rolled onto its side, maybe sleeping in the shade of a hawthorn bush. But as I walked closer, the stillness didn't seem right. It wasn't the lazy kind of stillness animals have when they're lying down. It was rigid, heavy, wrong. The smell hit me first. It wasn't fresh death. It was thick, sickly, almost sweet, like rot and heat mixed together. The kind of smell that sticks to the back of your throat. I stopped a few feet away and could already see the movement. The air above the sheep shimmered slightly, alive with flies. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, swarming around its rear end, crawling across its wool, landing, lifting, landing again. The sound of them was constant, a low, vibrating hum. I stepped closer, and that's when I realized the sheep wasn't dead. It was breathing, shallow, slow, but definitely breathing. Its head moved slightly as I approached, and one eye, glazed, unfocused, rolled toward me. The rest of it didn't move at all. Its legs were twisted under it like it had been trying to get up and couldn't. The wool on its hindquarters was matted and dark, almost black in places, soaked through with fluid that had dried and crusted. Then I saw what the flies were doing. The wool wasn't just dirty, it was moving. The flesh beneath it was alive with maggots, writhing in thick clumps where the skin had opened up. The smell was overwhelming up close, a mix of decay and ammonia. I could see where the wool had been eaten away, and underneath it the skin was slick and raw, crawling with the white bodies of the larvae. They moved in waves, piling over one another, vanishing into holes and folds of flesh, surfacing again. It was fly strike. I'd heard about it before, but I'd never seen it. When a sheep gets dirty, especially around the tail where dung builds up in the wool, the moisture and smell attract flies. They lay eggs there, and when the eggs hatch, the maggots start eating. They go through the wool first, then into the flesh. They don't stop. They can hollow out an animal from the inside if it's not found in time. Farmers usually check their flocks often enough to catch it, but out there, miles from any house, it was obvious this one had been on its own for too long. The sheep made a faint noise then. Not quite a bleat, just a low, broken sound that didn't sound like pain or fear, more like exhaustion. His body trembled once, weakly, then went still again. I could see its chest rise and fall slowly, the ribs showing through where the wool had been eaten away. The flies didn't leave even when it moved. They landed right back down, crawling over its eyes and mouth, over the wounds where the maggots worked. I stood there for a long time, frozen. There's a strange feeling that comes when you see something suffering like that. Something that's alive but so far gone it doesn't even seem aware of what's happening anymore. It was like watching life and death fighting in the same body, both refusing to let go. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have anything to help it, and I couldn't just walk away without doing something. But the only thing left to do was to end it. I didn't have a gun or anything quick, just a small camping knife in my pack. I thought about using it, but the idea of getting close enough, of touching that crawling, stinking mass of flesh, made my stomach turn. I couldn't bring myself to do it. I didn't want to make it worse or botch it. So I did the only thing I could. I went looking for help. I followed the fence line, hoping it would lead toward a farmhouse or some kind of property. It took nearly an hour before I saw one in the distance, just a roofline behind some trees. But when I finally reached it, the yard was empty. No one was home. I knocked on the door, waited. Nothing. I left a note on the gate explaining what I'd found and where, then went back the way I came. By the time I got back to the sheep, The sun was lower and the light had turned golden, but the scene hadn't changed. The flies were thicker, the air buzzing with them, and the sheep was still there, still breathing. Barely. His head rested flat now, eyes half shut. The maggots covered nearly half its rear end, white and wet, churning slowly like water boiling in a pot. The wool was soaked through, the ground beneath it dark from whatever fluids had seeped out. It was awful. I stood there and watched for a minute, and I knew it wouldn't be long. Its breathing had gone so faint that I could barely see its chest move anymore. I wanted to look away, but I didn't. I felt like I owed it that much to not walk away this time. Eventually, it stopped moving altogether. The sound of the flies stayed, filling the air like static, but the sheep didn't move again. I left it there. There wasn't anything else I could do. The smell clung to me the rest of the day, even after I'd walked miles away from it. It was in my clothes, in my hair, in the back of my throat. I tried to eat that night, but couldn't. I sat in my tent, watching the light fade, thinking about how quiet it must have been when it happened. How long that animal must have been lying there, feeling itself being eaten alive, unable to move or escape. Nature has its own kind of cruelty, not out of malice, but because things just happen that way. The flies weren't evil. They were doing what they always did, what they were meant to do. It just happened to be that this time it was something I saw. For the rest of that trip, I couldn't walk past a field of sheep without scanning for movement that looked wrong. I catch myself staring too long, making sure they were all standing, all moving normally. Sometimes I'd see one lying down and feel my chest tighten until it lifted its head. I'd never realized how much death existed quietly out there, tucked into corners of fields and forgotten pastures. Even now, years later, I still remember the smell before anything else, the heavy, sour heat of it, and the way the flies moved in clouds so thick they blurred the air. I remember how helpless I felt, standing there in that field, watching something suffer so slowly that it almost seemed impossible it could still be alive. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes from danger or shock. It was the kind that sits in your gut afterward, the kind that reminds you how fragile everything really is. That sheep had probably been alive for days like that, eaten piece by piece until there was almost nothing left of it. Every summer since then, when the air gets still and hot and the flies come out thick, I think about it. The sound, the smell, the movement, the way the countryside looks so calm on the surface, hiding things like that just out of sight. It didn't scare me because it was violent. It scared me because it was real, because that's how life ends sometimes. Slow, silent, and unseen, while the rest of the world just keeps on going. It happened in the summer of 1976. I was in my mid-20s then, spending a few weeks hiking and camping alone through the hills and fields that rolled between the small farming towns of northern England. It was something I did every year back then. Take a pack, a tent, a few supplies, and just walk for days at a time, sleeping wherever I ended up. There was a freedom in it, a quiet that I couldn't find anywhere else. I didn't think of it as dangerous or strange back then. It was just something that made me feel like I was part of the world instead of just living in it. The day it happened was one of those warm, heavy summer days where everything feels still. The air shimmered slightly in the distance, the sun pressing down just enough to make every movement slow. I'd been following a rough footpath that wound between stone walls and open meadows, heading toward a small village marked on my map. The hills were dotted with sheep, as they always were out there, little white specks grazing lazily in the grass. I'd seen hundreds of them over the years, always half wild, always keeping their distance. The path curved around the edge of a wide pasture bordered by old fencing. Some of it stone, some barbed wire, the kind that had clearly been patched and replaced dozens of times over the decades. It wasn't uncommon to see loose sections hanging, the posts leaning and the wire rusted and sagging. As I came around a small bend in the path, I noticed something white off to my left, not moving. At first, I thought it was just a sheep lying down in the grass, maybe resting in the shade of one of the fence posts. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The animal wasn't lying comfortably. It was twisted, one leg stretched back at an unnatural angle, caught up in a mess of barbed wire that had come loose from the post. I remember the way the sunlight hit its wool, bright and clean looking from a distance, But when I got closer, I saw it wasn't white at all. It was stained with dirt, dried blood, and the dull yellow of old infection. The sheep was still alive. Its head lifted weakly when I approached, eyes dull and glassy, its breathing shallow and uneven. Flies buzzed thick around it, a sound I can still hear in my head even now. I could see immediately that it had been there a while, days, maybe longer. The barbed wire had wound tightly around its hind leg, cutting deep into the flesh. The more it must have struggled, the tighter it got. But what really froze me was what the leg looked like. There was no meat left on it from the lower thigh down, just bone. The skin and muscle had been stripped away entirely, eaten by maggots that were still crawling over it, spilling from the open wound, shifting in slow, sickening waves. I don't remember how long I stood there. Time seemed to stop for a moment. The smell was awful, rot, blood, and the thick, warm stench of decay. I'd seen dead animals before, plenty of them, but never one still alive like that. Still aware, still trying to breathe through whatever pain it must have been in. The flies landed on its eyes, and it didn't even blink. I walked around it slowly, trying to see if maybe I could free it, but the wire was too tight. It had dug deep into the bone itself, and any movement made the sheep flinch slightly, the only sign it had any strength left. There was no way to unwind it without making it worse. I checked my pack, thinking maybe I had something that could help, but I only had a small camping knife, and even if I could cut the wire, it wouldn't have mattered. The leg was beyond saving. The animal was beyond saving. For a few minutes, I just stood there in the heat, sweat running down my back, the sound of flies filling the air. The fields stretched empty in every direction. No farmhouse in sight, no other people. Just me, the wind, the grass, and that one suffering creature. I remember looking at its face, how it would lift its head slightly, then drop it again, breathing shallowly, eyes rolling just a little each time. It was like it was half gone already. I didn't know what to do. Leaving it there felt cruel, but watching it like that felt worse. The thought of walking away and pretending I hadn't seen it didn't sit right. I couldn't bring myself to do that. I'd grown up around farms, and I knew what had to be done in situations like that, but it's one thing to understand it and another thing to do it yourself. I looked around again, trying to think of some way to get help, but there wasn't anyone around for miles. Even if I'd gone for a farmer, it would have taken hours. By then, the sheep would have either died slowly or been eaten alive by whatever came across it next. I didn't want that for it, so I did the only thing I could do. I took out my knife, went to its head, and tried to make it quick. I don't want to describe that part too much. It wasn't clean, and it wasn't easy, but I made sure it was over. When it stopped moving, I just stood there, breathing hard, staring at what was left. The silence after it was done was strange, like the air itself had gone still. The flies didn't stop, the wind didn't stop, but everything else seemed to. I untangled the barbed wire from its leg afterward, cutting the loose parts and pushing them aside. The bones were white, smooth, stripped clean in places where the maggots had done their work. I don't think I'd ever seen anything that both horrified and saddened me so much at once. I dragged the body a few feet away from the fence, into the grass, so nothing else would get caught there, then sat down on the dry earth beside it. For a long time, I didn't move. I watched the clouds drift overhead, listened to the grass rustle and the insects buzz, and tried not to think about the sound it had made when it took its last breath. It wasn't loud, just a faint, broken exhale. But it stayed with me. Eventually, I stood up, wiped my hands on the grass, and started walking again. I didn't look back, though I wanted to. The rest of the day passed in silence. I don't even remember where I camped that night. I just remember feeling heavy, like I was carrying something I couldn't put down. When I got home at the end of that trip, I told no one about it. It felt like something too personal, too sad to talk about. It wasn't a story. It was just a moment that had carved itself into my memory and refused to fade. It's been decades since then, but I still think about it sometimes. Not every day, but enough. Whenever I see sheep in a field or rusted wire along an old fence, that memory comes back. I can still see the way the sunlight fell across the bones, how quiet the air was, how the hills looked endless and empty all around me. People always talk about the beauty of hiking, of being close to nature and finding peace in the wild. And most of the time, that's true. But sometimes nature isn't peaceful. Sometimes it's just cruel in a way that feels too real to look at. I still walk those kinds of trails when I can, though I'm older now and slower. But every time I come across a stretch of old fencing or hear the distant bleating of sheep, I find myself stopping for a moment, scanning the fields just to make sure nothing's caught, nothing's struggling. I never saw anything like that again, but part of me still expects to. That day didn't scare me like a nightmare or a threat. It scared me because it showed me something raw and unfiltered, the kind of suffering that just happens quietly when no one's there to see it. And maybe that's why it's the one memory from all those years of hiking that never left me. It's been almost 50 years, but I still remember the heat of that afternoon, the smell in the air, and that helpless feeling that comes when you realize all you can do is end something's pain and walk away from it. It was late July when I decided to take a solo hike through a stretch of forest I hadn't explored before. It wasn't far from home, just a 2-hour drive north, but it was one of those places that never really felt close to anything. A mix of hardwoods and wetlands, thick with vines and undergrowth, the kind of terrain where the trail disappears if you stop paying attention for more than a few seconds. I picked it because it wasn't popular. I didn't want crowds or chatter. I wanted quiet, something that made me feel like I'd really stepped out of the world for a while. I started early, right after sunrise. The air was already heavy, the kind of damp heat that sticks to your skin and makes every breath feel slow. The sky was bright but hazy. The sun filtered through a pale sheet of clouds. The forest smelled like earth and wet bark. I wore my usual, long sleeves, thick hiking pants, boots laced tight, and a wide-brimmed hat. I'd learned long ago that no matter how warm it gets, it's better to be covered up. Insects don't care how uncomfortable you are. The trail was narrow and uneven, more of an animal path than a maintained route. I could tell it hadn't seen many hikers lately. The grass and ferns brushed against my legs as I went, wet from morning dew. Every few steps I'd hear the faint buzz of mosquitoes in my ear, that sharp whine that cuts right into your nerves. They were relentless. Even with repellent, they hovered close, waiting for any bit of skin I missed. After about an hour, I came to a low area where the ground dipped into a swampy stretch. The air changed there. It grew thicker, sourer, like something had been rotting under the surface for too long. I could see the stagnant pools ahead, water dark as oil, ringed with cattails and floating scum. The trail cut straight through it, wooden planks half sunken into the mud, slick with algae. I stepped carefully, testing each board before I put my weight on it. Mosquitoes were everywhere. They moved in clouds, swarming my face, clinging to the fabric of my sleeves. I pulled my hat down low and kept walking, breathing through my nose to avoid swallowing them. It was unbearable, but I told myself it wouldn't last long. Once I got through the swamp, I'd be back on higher, drier ground where they weren't so bad. But it didn't get better. Even after I climbed out of the lowlands, they followed. I could see them gathering in the air ahead of me, shimmering in the sunlight like tiny bits of dust. Every few seconds, one would land on my hands or neck, and I'd feel that quick, sharp sting. I wiped them away until my skin was streaked with red smears. The deeper I went, the worse it got. The buzzing grew constant, loud enough to drown out the sound of my boots on the dirt. I'd never seen them like this before, not even in the thickest marshlands down south. It wasn't just a few here and there. It was a swarm, a living wall of them that pulsed and shifted with the air. I started to feel dizzy, like the heat was pressing in on me. My clothes clung to my skin, sweat mixing with the layer of insect repellent until everything felt sticky. I tried to focus on the trail, to ignore the sound and keep moving. I figured maybe there was something nearby attracting them. Standing water, a dead animal, something like that. If I could just get past it, maybe it would thin out. But then I noticed something strange. The forest around me had gone completely silent. No birds, no crickets, not even the distant hum of wind through the leaves. Just the constant drone of mosquitoes, that heavy, rising hum that filled every space, vibrating against my eardrums. It was like the entire world had gone still except for them. I kept walking, pushing through the branches, brushing them off my clothes. My arms were covered in tiny welts. My neck felt like it was on fire. The smell of bug spray had turned sharp and chemical, mixing with the sweat and the sour rot in the air. I felt the first flicker of real unease then. Not fear exactly, but that animal awareness that something wasn't right. I stopped for a second and turned slowly in place, looking around. The forest was dense on all sides, sunlight barely reaching the ground. I didn't see anything unusual, just trees, ferns, a few fallen logs. But there was movement, faint, low to the ground, maybe 30 feet ahead. I caught it just for a second. A ripple in the air, like heat rising off pavement. I blinked, and it was gone. The mosquitoes thickened in front of me, clustering so tightly I could barely see through them. It looked like smoke. I waved my arm through it, and they scattered just long enough to reveal a patch of ground beyond the trail. The earth there was darker, softer, like it had been turned over recently. I stepped closer. The smell hit me before I reached it, a deep, sweet rot that filled my throat. Then I saw the carcass. It was a deer, what was left of one anyway. The body was bloated, the fur matted down with mud. Its eyes were gone, and its legs were half sunk into the wet ground. The air above it shimmered with insects. The noise they made was almost deafening. They weren't just feeding on it, they were covering it. A solid layer of movement. I took a step back, my stomach tightening. The smell was overpowering. It wasn't fresh, it had been there a while, but the mosquitoes were so thick around it that it looked like it was still alive, still shifting. I could see them crawling over the open flesh, their bodies glistening in the sunlight, thousands of them packed into every wound. I turned away, moving back to the trail. My breathing was quick now, my skin crawling. I tried to brush them off again, but they just kept coming. It felt like they were everywhere. Inside my sleeves, under my collar, crawling in my hair. Every time I swiped at one, two more landed. I started walking faster, almost jogging. The trail twisted uphill again, steep and narrow. My boots slipped in the loose dirt. My vision swam from the heat, and the air seemed to buzz not just around me but inside my head. It was hard to tell if the sound was still the insects or if it had become something internal, a constant vibration in my skull. By the time I reached a clearing near the top, my arms and neck were covered in red spots. My face burned. I could feel them even through the fabric of my shirt, biting through the thin weave. I stumbled into the open space, swatting blindly, spinning in place like I could somehow escape them. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. One moment the air was alive with them, and the next it was still. The buzzing faded, breaking apart until there was nothing but silence. The space around me was empty again. The only sound was my breathing. I stood there, trembling, my shirt damp with sweat, my hat stained dark around the brim. I don't know why they left or what had drawn them in the first place. Maybe it was the carcass. Maybe it was something in the air that day. But the forest felt wrong after that, like it had shifted in some subtle way I couldn't name. I turned back down the trail, walking faster than before. The woods looked the same, but the silence was heavy, pressing in around me. Every time a leaf brushed against my sleeve, I flinched. My skin still itched, but I didn't stop to scratch. I just wanted out. When I finally saw the car again through the trees, parked crooked by the gate, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like I'd escaped something that hadn't noticed me leaving. I stripped my jacket off before getting inside, shaking it out to make sure nothing was still clinging to it. Then I sat there for a while, engine off, hands on the steering wheel, trying to let my heart slow down. That night, when I got home, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and counted the welts. There were too many to keep track of. My skin was a map of raised bumps, some already starting to swell. I could still smell the forest on me, the rot, the chemicals, the stale sweat. I told myself it was just a bad day, that the heat and the stagnant water had drawn the worst of the bugs. But sometimes, when I think about that deer and the way the insects moved over it like a single breathing thing, I feel that same crawling sensation under my skin again. I still hike, but not in the deep woods anymore. I stick to higher trails now, places with wind and rock and open space. I wear long sleeves and a hat, always, even in the heat. Not just for the sun or the bugs, but because I can't stand the feeling of skin exposed out there anymore. It's strange how small things, mosquitoes, gnats, flies, can make you feel powerless. It's not like facing something big or obvious. It's quieter than that, slower. You don't realize what's happening until it's too late, until the sound fills your head, until the air itself feels alive, until the forest turns into something that doesn't want you there at all. It was one of those long, hot summer hikes where the air feels heavy and the world moves slow. The kind of heat that makes the dirt smell stronger, makes your clothes stick to your skin, and turns every breath into something thick and dry. I'd been walking since early morning, following a stretch of farmland trail that cut through open fields and narrow patches of trees. The land rolled in slow waves, stone walls, faded fences, and scattered sheep grazing in the distance. I remember thinking how quiet everything felt, just the wind brushing through the grass and the hum of insects. It was late afternoon when I came across it. The sun was still high, burning down on the back of my neck, and the shadows were short and sharp. I was following a thin, uneven fence line that bordered a wide pasture when I saw something off to my left. A shape lying near the edge of the fence, caught in the tall weeds. At first, I thought it was just a pile of old wool from a shearing, maybe something left behind, but the closer I got, the clearer it became that it wasn't just wool. It was an animal, a sheep. It was lying awkwardly, twisted slightly on its side. One leg stretched out behind it at an odd angle. Its head was up, but barely, eyes dull and sunken, its breathing slow and shallow. The wool around its haunches was darkened and crusted, and the smell hit me before I was close enough to see what was wrong. It wasn't the usual farm smell. It was sour and thick, the kind of smell that makes your stomach turn. When I got close enough to really look, I saw what had happened. The sheep's back leg had been tangled in a strand of barbed wire, probably part of the fence that had come loose and curled into the grass. It must have stepped into it, panicked, and twisted itself tighter and tighter until it couldn't move. The wire had cut deep into the flesh, so deep that it had killed the leg. The lower part wasn't even flesh anymore. It was just bone, slick and white in the sun, with scraps of dry tissue hanging from it. The worst part wasn't that it was still alive. The worst part was that it was somehow still surviving. The leg had been dead for some time, maybe days, but the sheep was still breathing, still blinking slowly when the flies landed on its face. When I crouched beside it, I saw movement all along the dead limb. Took me a second to realize what it was. The entire leg was crawling with maggots, hundreds of them, packed thick into the open wound, squirming and shifting. The sight made my chest tighten, but what really froze me was understanding that those maggots were probably the only reason the sheep was still alive. I'd read something once, long ago, about how certain kinds of maggots eat only dead flesh, not living tissue. Doctors sometimes used sterile versions of them to clean out infected wounds. The maggots would eat the rotting parts, clearing out the dead material and keeping infection from spreading. Looking at that sheep, I realized that was exactly what was happening. The wire had cut off the circulation, the leg had died, and the maggots had come. They had eaten everything that had gone rotten, leaving only the bone. As horrible as it looked, they had kept it from getting infected. They had kept it alive. I stood there for a long time just watching. The sheep barely moved. Its eyes were half closed, its breathing shallow, but it was still there, still conscious. It must have been through hell, lying in that heat day after day, half its body rotting while the other half fought to stay alive. The flies buzzed around my head, landing on my arms and face, drawn by the smell. I brushed them away and stepped back, but I couldn't take my eyes off that leg. It was such a strange, terrible balance. Life hanging on by the smallest, most grotesque chance. The thought crossed my mind that I should try to help it, but there was nothing I could really do. I didn't have tools, and even if I freed it, the sheep wouldn't survive. It would collapse and die from shock or blood loss within minutes. The only mercy I could give it was to end it quickly, but I didn't have a gun, and I wasn't sure I had the nerve to do it by hand. So, I just stood there, sweating under the sun, watching this living thing struggle to keep breathing while its body had already started to decay. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I couldn't stay there any longer. I walked along the fence, looking for a farmhouse, anyone I could tell, but there was nothing nearby, just the rolling hills and the faint bleating of other sheep far off. When I came back around the bend, the injured one was still lying there, barely moving now. His head had dropped to the ground. The maggots were still working, still alive even if it barely was. I walked past it and didn't look back. I told myself I'd find a farmer and report it, but I never did. By the time I got to the next road, I was too drained to go knocking on doors. I set up camp that evening in a small stand of trees, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that leg, the bone gleaming in the sun, the writhing movement of the maggots, the slow rise and fall of the sheep's chest. For days afterward, I thought about it constantly. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something heavier, something like guilt mixed with awe. It was horrifying, but also strange in how it showed me the sheer will of life to keep going, no matter how broken or hopeless the body was. That sheep should have died long before I found it, but it hadn't. The very things that looked like decay had been the only reason it was still breathing. That image never left me. Even now, years later, I still think about it when I hike through pastures or see animals grazing behind old wire fences. I always find myself stopping, scanning the edges of fields, looking for anything that seems out of place, anything that might be caught or struggling. I never saw another case like that again, but once you've seen something like it, it sticks with you. It changed the way I think about death in the wild. Out there, it isn't quick or clean. It's slow, messy, and quiet. Sometimes nature gives mercy in the strangest ways, like a swarm of maggots keeping a dying animal alive a few days longer by cleaning away what's already gone. It's easy to think of maggots as disgusting, but that day I realized they were just another part of how things work out there. They weren't cruel or kind. They just did what they were meant to do. When I finished my trip, I told a friend about it. He said the maggots probably saved the sheep from infection, that they were doing what doctors sometimes use them for in hospitals, eating the dead tissue to keep the rest alive. The thought made sense, but it didn't make the memory any easier. The image of that living thing being kept alive by the same process that was devouring it stayed with me. Even now, when I walk alone on warm summer days and the air is thick and quiet, I sometimes catch that smell in my memory, the smell of rot and dirt and heat. It always comes back in flashes, that feeling of being completely alone with something suffering beyond help. The sheep probably didn't last more than a day or two after I left it. Maybe the maggots kept it from feeling the worst of it. Maybe it slipped away quietly when the heat faded and the flies moved on. Either way, I still remember that it fought to live even when its body was half gone. I don't tell that story often because it's not one people like to hear. It's not exciting or dramatic. It's just real. And sometimes the real things, especially the quiet, ugly ones, are the hardest to forget. It was late September when I went hiking alone in Vermont, during that stretch of the year when the air turns sharp and the trees burn with color. The forests up there have this deep stillness to them in autumn. Every sound feels muted, like the air itself is listening. I'd gone up for a few days just to get away from work and noise. I had a small tent, a pack, and a rough plan to follow a network of trails that looped through a mix of state land and private logging property. It wasn't remote wilderness, but it was far enough from towns that cell service dropped out halfway up the ridge. That first morning was perfect. I started early, when the ground was still wet from dew and the forest floor was soft with fallen leaves. The light came through the canopy in slow golden patches, and the only sounds were the rhythm of my boots and the occasional call of a crow. I stopped once to eat an apple on a rock overlooking a small valley that stretched out under the morning fog. Everything felt calm and normal, exactly the kind of quiet I'd been looking for. By early afternoon, I'd covered around 8 miles. The trail I was on was old, not one of the well-marked hiking routes, but a narrow path marked by faded blue blazes on tree trunks. The air had grown cooler, and I could smell damp earth and pine. The path sloped upward, winding around rocks and roots, and then flattened near a thick patch of woods that hadn't been cut in years. The trees there grew close together, their trunks dark and rough, the forest floor covered in ferns and fallen branches. That's when I saw it, the red shirt. At first, I only noticed the color, this strange flash of bright red in the middle of all the greens and browns. It was hanging maybe 20 or 30 feet off the trail, up in a low branch of a maple tree. It looked clean, almost new, the kind of red you see on sports shirts. My first thought was that someone must have dropped it or hung it there to mark a trail or find their way back. It stood out so much that curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped off the trail to check it out. The forest was thick, and the ground underfoot felt soft and uneven. I pushed through low brush, keeping my eyes on the shirt as I got closer. When I reached it, I realized it wasn't just draped over the branch. It had been carefully tied there by the sleeves, like someone had intentionally hung it up. The fabric moved a little in the breeze. For a moment I stood there, wondering why anyone would leave it like that. Then I noticed something else behind it, maybe 20 feet farther back through the trees. The ground looked disturbed. At first it just seemed like uneven dirt, but when I walked closer, I could see it clearly, 2 fresh mounds of soil side by side. Each was about 6 feet long and maybe 2 or 3 feet wide. The earth was still dark and loose, the kind that hadn't settled yet. There were faint impressions of shovel marks along the edges. I stopped immediately, my body stiffening. The woods were dead silent around me. No wind, no insects, just stillness. I could feel the hair on my arms rise. My first thought was that maybe someone had been burying pets or doing some kind of soil work, but that didn't make sense. It was too deep into the woods for that, and the way the dirt was packed, neatly mounded, no rocks, no signs of plants being replanted, looked wrong, like something you'd see in a graveyard. I took a few slow steps back, trying to process what I was looking at. Then my eyes caught on something else, just a few feet beyond the fresh mounds. Small, moss-covered stones, half sunk into the ground. I walked closer, carefully, and realized they were old headstones. Maybe 4 or 5 of them, leaning at angles, their surfaces cracked and faded. The writing was so weathered it was hard to make out, but I could see faint letters and dates carved into them. That's when a strange chill went through me. Not from the air, but from the feeling that this place wasn't supposed to be here. The graves were old, probably decades, maybe a century old, yet 2 of them were clearly new. Someone had been digging here recently, and the red shirt seemed like some kind of marker. I looked around, scanning the trees, half expecting to see someone standing nearby. But there was no one, just forest and silence. I stood there for maybe a minute, heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. I didn't want to get too close. I didn't want to touch anything. I turned slowly, listening, and thought I heard something faint in the distance. A single metallic clink, like a shovel hitting rock. It was far off, but it sent a jolt through me. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I backed away from the graves, retracing my steps toward the trail, moving as quietly as I could. When I reached the path again, I walked fast, almost jogging, looking over my shoulder every few seconds. The woods suddenly felt different, heavier somehow, like the trees were pressing in on me. I hiked until I reached a section of the trail that crossed an old logging road. There I finally stopped to catch my breath. The whole thing felt unreal. My hands were shaking, and I kept replaying the image of those dirt mounds in my head. I made it back to my car just before sunset. My instinct told me not to ignore it, so I drove straight into town. The ranger station was closed for the day, but I found a local police station and reported what I'd seen. I explained everything exactly as it happened, the shirt, the graves, the sound in the distance. The officer on duty wrote it all down, asked for the location as best as I could describe it, and said they'd send someone out to check. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept picturing the 2 fresh mounds, the headstones tilted at odd angles, the red fabric twisting in the wind. It felt like something was deeply wrong about it, beyond just the idea of graves in the middle of the forest. There was a deliberateness to the way the shirt was hung, the neatness of the dirt, the placement beside older stones. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, I drove back to the station to see if they'd found anything. One of the officers recognized me and told me they'd been up there early that morning. They confirmed what I saw: 2 freshly dug graves, several old headstones, and the red shirt tied to a tree branch. What they told me next made my stomach turn. Apparently, Someone had been stealing headstones from a small historic graveyard about 10 miles from that area. Over the past few months, several had gone missing, ripped right out of the ground. The ones I found matched the ones that had been stolen. They said it looked like whoever did it had been relocating them into the woods, maybe for some strange reason or ritual, though they didn't know why. The graves themselves were empty, just piles of dirt, freshly dug, nothing buried. But the fact that someone had taken the time to move headstones, to dig graves in the middle of nowhere, and to mark the area with something bright like a red shirt, it was unsettling in a way that stuck with me. They told me they didn't find anyone nearby, just shovel marks and some footprints leading deeper into the woods. After that, I left Vermont early. The trip was supposed to last a few days, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I tried to relax, that image of the graves and the red shirt came back. The forest no longer felt peaceful. It felt hollow, disturbed, like something beneath the surface had been turned over and left unfinished. Even now, I think about it sometimes, especially when I'm hiking alone and see something out of place. A scrap of fabric, a patch of disturbed soil, a stone where it shouldn't be. There's something deeply wrong about seeing signs of the dead in the middle of untouched nature, something that doesn't sit right in your mind. It wasn't supernatural and it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Someone had been walking those same woods, dragging stolen headstones through the trees, digging false graves, leaving signs for reasons no one fully understood. I don't know if they were just stealing, or if it was something worse, but I've never gone off trail alone since then. Every time I think back to that red shirt hanging in the breeze, I can still see how bright it looked against the dark trees, how it caught my eye just enough to pull me off the path and into that patch of forest I never should have entered. And I always wonder, if I'd gone there an hour earlier or later, would I have seen whoever was digging, or would they have seen me first? It was late spring in Tennessee, one of those weeks when the air feels clean again after months of cold. I went hiking with my old roommate and another friend that weekend, just trying to get out of town for a while. We picked a trail that wasn't too well known, one of those places you find after scrolling through random forums where people post about hidden gems and secluded routes. It was deep in the woods, far enough that the cell service dropped off about 20 minutes into the drive, and the roads turned from asphalt to dirt. We parked near a rusted gate with a "No maintenance beyond this point" sign, shouldered our packs, and started walking. The morning was warm, quiet except for the sound of insects and birds. The trees were thick, mostly oak and pine, with undergrowth so dense you couldn't see far past the trail. Every now and then, we'd pass some old beer cans or faded ribbons tied to branches, probably left by hunters years ago. It was that kind of place, untouched but not completely forgotten. The trail wound steadily uphill for about an hour, the air getting heavier the deeper we went. The sound of water grew faint in the distance, and soon we came to a small stream cutting through the woods. It wasn't wide, maybe 10 or 12 feet across, but the water was moving quick, clear and cold. The rocks were slick with moss, and the banks were soft, covered in layers of fallen leaves that stuck to your boots. I remember stopping there, just taking it in for a second. The sun came through the trees in strips, lighting up the water and catching the mist that hung above it. It looked peaceful, one of those spots you'd think about later when you wanted to remember something good. But then something shifted. Across the stream, maybe 20 yards away, I saw movement through the trees, figures stepping out from the shadows. At first, I thought it was just another group of hikers coming from the other direction. But then I noticed what they were wearing, or more accurately, what they weren't. There were about 5 or 6 of them, all men, standing on the far bank. Every one of them was completely naked except for socks and shoes. They didn't have backpacks or gear, nothing that made sense for hiking out there. Just pale skin, mud on their legs, and the kind of stillness that made the whole thing feel wrong. They weren't laughing or talking or even moving much. They stood there, just looking at the water, like they were waiting for something. The sunlight caught on their skin in patches through the branches, and for a second it didn't even feel real. There was something animal-like about it. Bare bodies in the woods, quiet, alert, not belonging to the world I knew. I froze where I was, unsure whether to move forward or back. My brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe they were doing some weird endurance thing, or it was a dare, or maybe there was a swimming hole nearby. But the longer I watched, the less normal it seemed. None of them were carrying towels or clothes. There wasn't a pile of stuff anywhere. Just the men standing there, all wearing nothing but socks and shoes. They started to cross the stream slowly, one by one, stepping into the water like they'd done it before. The current wasn't strong enough to stop them, but it was cold enough that you could see their muscles tense as they moved through it. They didn't look at us, didn't glance up or acknowledge that we were standing right there on the opposite side. They just kept crossing, their faces blank, focused on the far bank behind us. I could hear the water splashing around their legs, the sound of it breaking the still air. It was strange how calm everything felt, how quiet it was except for that steady noise of moving water. I realized I was holding my breath without meaning to. They stepped out of the stream on our side, dripping and silent, the wet sound of feet on rocks mixing with the rustling leaves. Then they walked past, maybe 30 feet away, and disappeared into the trees behind us without a word or a glance. We just stood there, watching the last one vanish into the woods. The forest swallowed them completely, the undergrowth shifting slightly in their wake, then settling again. The sound of their footsteps faded fast. The whole thing lasted maybe a minute, maybe two, long enough to know what I saw, but short enough that afterward it felt like it could have been imagined. The air went still again, the stream rushing steady like nothing had happened. I remember my skin prickling all over, like I'd just been through something dangerous even though nothing had actually happened. There was this heavy awareness that we were deep in the woods, miles from a road, no signal, no one else around. And those men had just been there, walking barefoot through the trees like it was the most natural thing in the world. We didn't linger by the stream. We just moved on, following the trail uphill. The woods grew thicker, darker, quieter as we went, and even though there was no sound of anyone following, I kept glancing back every few minutes, expecting to see one of them standing on the trail. I didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't gone far. The deeper we went, the more it felt like the forest had changed. The birds had gone silent. The air smelled damp and heavy, like wet bark and old leaves. The sunlight barely reached the ground now, and the wind had stopped. Every time the trail turned, I half expected to see another one of those men ahead of us, standing still, waiting. After a while, we reached another stream, smaller this time, with muddy banks and a half-collapsed bridge made of rotted boards. The footprints were there before I saw the water. Bare prints, deep in the mud, toes splayed out, like someone had crossed not long ago. A few of them had the faint outline of socks still visible in the dirt. The prints went across, then vanished into the woods again. It felt wrong to keep going, so we didn't. We turned back, following the same route down. The whole way, I kept listening for the sound of water splashing, for footsteps behind us, for anything. There was nothing but the soft hum of insects and the steady rhythm of my boots on the dirt. When we got back to the car, the air felt lighter, but I couldn't shake the unease. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the discomfort of having seen something that shouldn't have been there, something too strange to explain but too real to forget. Later that night, I looked it up out of curiosity. Turns out it's actually a thing. Naked hiking, some call it. People who hike without clothes, often in remote areas, claiming it's a way to connect with nature or feel free. Some do it in groups. Some even plan entire routes around it. That's what I read, anyway. But even knowing that, I still think about that day and how wrong it felt in the moment. Maybe it was just the place, the isolation, the silence, the way they moved through the woods without a sound. Maybe it was because they didn't acknowledge us at all, didn't laugh or seem surprised. They were just there, as if they belonged to that forest in a way we didn't. I think what unsettled me most wasn't that they were naked. It was how calm they were, how synchronized, how quiet, how absolutely indifferent to anything around them. Like they weren't really people out for a hike, but something else entirely. Part of the woods itself, moving through it the same way the water did, slow and steady and unbothered. We never went back to that trail. Every time I think about hiking somewhere new now, I find myself sticking to the places with parking lots, signs, and other people. I like the wild, but I don't want to be that far from the world again. because it's one thing to be alone in the woods. It's another thing entirely to realize you're not, and to know that whatever else is out there might not care one bit that you are.